Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. Welcome back again. I'm sorry to interrupt your conversations and so on because we are short of time. I have the honor now to welcome and introduce the next speaker, Professor Alma Harris. I asked her what should I be telling the audience about her, and she said she's here because of me. So I'm going to be very biased. I brought her to the University of Malaya when I was Vice Chancellor, and the idea was to get her to bring up the faculty education to a higher world level. And I think in that remarkable 4 years, right, Prof? In 4 years, she has done a tremendous job, and we are very, very proud of that. And I think the productivity in the Center for Educational Leadership, where she is the boss there now, is really very, very high. We have never seen such productivity before. And I really hope that she can be around for many, many more years to see that we continue to rise in that field. She'll be telling us the same like what Prof. Feng Dashuan has told us, but in different settings and from different countries. Of course, she's very, very well qualified to tell us all that because she's also a very senior academic and a very high-profile academic. So may I welcome Prof. Alma Harris. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It is the case that I'm here because of Prof. Gauth. I originally came for a year, and that was 4.5 years ago. And I'd also like to introduce my Deputy Director, Dr. Michelle Jones, who's accompanied me here, and on the journey of transformation and change at my institute at the University of Malaya. It is a huge privilege to be here. Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for allowing me to address such a auspicious and well-informed audience. I have to say at the outset, just to be clear, I'm not an expert on higher education. I know we've got many experts in the room, so I'm slightly, in trepidation here when I think about actually addressing you. So forgive me, all errors are my own, and all views are my own. And I come to talk to you today from an experience of working largely in the United Kingdom. Originally from Wales, although I went to universities in Wales, but my career has largely been in England. I've worked at the Open University, at the University of Bath, the University of Nottingham, the University of Warwick, and latterly University College London. Although when I joined it, it was the Institute of Education that is now subsequently merged. So I come to talk to you today really with that experience in mind, thinking about some contrasts and some comparisons with the university sector, both private and public here in Malaysia. And I guess that's really where I wanted to start. I wanted to start with Malaysia. People say constantly, why did you come to Malaysia? And normally I say things like, well, obviously it's because of the food, because if they haven't fed you yet, they will feed you almost immediately after, and the weather and everything else that Malaysia brings. The real reason, however, was not any of those things. The real reason I'm here is to learn, and I guess to come to a very different part of the world, a very different higher education sector, has been enormously interesting, challenging, and also thought-provoking. So in a sense, I bring, I guess, East and West here today, mostly West, but latterly East, and to think about what the future is for higher education, particularly in a global world, in a global context. And that's really the main theme of my talk, is what is the effect of globalization? And forgive me if I repeat some of the things that the previous speaker has said, but I hope in a way that's more reinforcement than repetition. In terms of being in Malaysia, what have I learned so far? Well, primarily I've learned to be a very bad driver. That's what I've learned to be. I go back to England and they find me very dangerous because in a way, all I'm doing is driving like Malaysians, right? But in England, we have this sort of routine where if there is a stop sign, we actually stop. And clearly now I do not. So I'm not a very bad driver, according to those in England. But I've learned a heck of a lot more, I guess. I've learned about the wonderful University of Malaya and its wonderful ex-Vice Chancellor. I mean, Prof Gauth, I haven't had the chance to say thank you to you, but your leadership has been, I think, inspirational. And I think wherever you are, your leadership sort of shines through. So I'm going to sort of talk today about three things. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the leadership challenges that we're currently facing. And I think the globalization, the massification of higher education has meant that we are facing some new challenges that we probably hadn't even thought of 20 years ago, 25 years ago when I started my career. The world is now different. As Thomas Friedman says, the world is now flat, and certainly globalization has supported that particular fact. I'm going to talk about some of the responses because it's all too easy to highlight some of the challenges, but what are universities doing to respond to some of these challenges? And I'm going to be talking from an English perspective about some of the things that they're doing. And finally, I'm going to be talking about what I really know about, I suppose, and that's leadership, the importance of leadership, and asking the question, at this critical time for higher education in East and West, what types of leadership do we need, and what types of leadership will take us forward as we transform our universities and our university systems? I guess a starting point is a recognition that when we talk about higher education, there is a massive economic imperative. In England, for example, the university sector contributes a huge amount to the gross domestic product of that particular country. And I think we have to recognise that as well as an altruistic reason, as well as a moral purpose, there's also a fundamental economic purpose to the reasons why higher education establishments exist. There are more than 150 institutions of higher education in the United Kingdom. That's a lot more. Our higher education system sector has grown enormously since the 1960s. More new universities, more student participation. More than 50% of our students in the United Kingdom go to university. That's dramatically different from the 1960s. So that shift has changed the face of higher education in England. And I'm sure you've heard this, but competition is also very high. For the first time, I think, in several decades, we see an intensification of competition between universities, both private and public. And that generates its own tensions and challenges within the system. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about competition on a global platform as well as on a local and national platform. As well as the economic imperative, there is, of course, the social imperative, the reason why we do what we do. And that's to ensure that both there is a steady stream of graduates going from higher education into employability. And I guess what we've seen, and particularly in this part of the world, more dramatically, I think, than anywhere else, is what's been termed the massification of higher education, the increased participation from low-income countries in now higher education. So that's had a dramatic effect on what universities do, what they think they're about, and how they currently operate. So the world has changed in terms of those things. And I think there's enormous pressure at the present time in England, I would say, on universities to be everything, to deliver an economic imperative, to also deliver the social imperative, but also to do things in terms of altruism and moral purpose. So I think universities are under enormous pressure to deliver that with less resource. And I'll say a little bit about the less resource, because that's an important part of the contextual landscape of England, and possibly here in Malaysia, but more so in England, as the available resources have actually reduced. I'm going to be drawing upon this particular study because I wouldn't want to claim some of this as my own, because it's not. And I think it's actually a really good report because it talks about the Entrepreneurial University. And part of what I'm going to argue today is that we need to be much more entrepreneurial in the higher education sector than ever before. We need many more entrepreneurial leaders like Prof Gauth to take universities forward. And we need to be thinking differently about the way we lead our universities, both from the top, from the middle, and from the bottom. And I'm going to argue very strongly that we need a different form of leadership if we're going to see university transformation and change in the 21st century. So I'm going to be drawing upon this report, not totally, but partially, and I just want to acknowledge, I guess, people like Alan Gibb from Durham Business School, who've written a lot about the entrepreneurial imperative of universities and why we need more entrepreneurs. Okay, so let me take you through, first of all, this is directly from that report, and I think it's actually quite a useful synopsis of where we are. In the middle are all the things that we know. The massification, employability, globalization, competitiveness. And then we've got, in a sense, a certain world that I think is gone, and an uncertain world. And I'm going to be talking about the uncertain world. The world has changed for higher education, and now we need different sorts of responses. I'm also going to be talking about the complex. In the past, universities were certain. They knew their funding, they knew their place, they knew their role. And they were simple. The functions were simple, a lot simpler in 1960s than in 2016. And what these authors have argued is we're now in complex and uncertain times. And we need to be looking at universities in light of those two dimensions. The certainty, the simplicity has in a sense gone. It's a past, faded generation of higher education. We're now in a different paradigm, to use the word of Thomas Kern, a different paradigm where we're facing more complexity, more uncertainty, and a faster pace as those things arrive. And I'll be talking about new technologies as well. So let's, in a way, think about, first of all, one of the first challenge, okay? I've got several challenges, and again, these may not be new to you, but I think we need to look at the challenges and then look at the responses. And I'm going to be looking at the responses through an English lens, but I want you to think about your context and where you're currently sitting, whether it's Malaysia or another university. How is your university responding to some of these challenges? Well, the first is the global marketplace, and I shouldn't need to say this standing where I am in Malaysia. We know that India is an opening market, a burgeoning market for higher education. China, we are sitting in the middle of an Asian gold mine in terms of the future of higher education. Student movement, huge numbers of students wanting access in China and India, in other parts of Asia, to higher education, and looking towards Malaysia as well as other countries. In England, we've got greater autonomy. The good news is that universities have been given greater autonomy to look after their own affairs, look after their own finances, less government interference. The bad news is they've been given more autonomy with less resource. So there's a tension here that we're seeing, particularly in England, between greater autonomy to grow in a university, to diversify, at the same time, less resource, less government funding, less support. So suddenly in England, they've been set adrift for the last decade or so in terms of those two things. I also want to talk about international students. Looking around the room, we all sort of know that international students are important. But if you look at the amount of money generated from international students in the UK, it is quite substantial. So suddenly here's the economic imperative again. We need international students, not just because it's fabulous for diversity and learning, but because actually they are very lucrative. And I hate to say that, but they are, all right? They are very lucrative. Now, universities in England have approached this in a variety of different ways. And these are some of the responses, the different responses to internationalization, the sorts of things that universities around the world are doing. And I'm not going to read down all of them because some of them are obvious. Prof Gouth brought me in as international faculty, for example. There are joint degrees. The University of Malaya has a joint degree with the University of Southampton. We're seeing a proliferation of these new degrees. Lots of projects, visiting scholars. And I guess one of the key things that some universities have done in England, not all, is actually to build a campus in a different country. So here you have the University of Nottingham building its campus in Malaysia and also in Ningbo in China. That's just one strategy to get more international students to come through the doors. Now, there's a question mark, because as international students come through the doors in a local country, in Malaysia, in Ningbo, what happens to the international fees? And I'll say something about the fee situation in England, which is less than comfortable and very, very controversial. So that's our first challenge, internationalization. How do we do that? How do we maximize it? How do we ensure that investment in a new campus like the one in Malaysia, several years old now, of course, brings those students and brings that net gain, the return on investment? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, to survive, universities have to be profit-making. They have to be profit-making. So any investment, there has to be a return. Okay. This is the second issue that I wanted to sort of talk about. And this is to do with England and the United Kingdom. Although Wales and Scotland, who are not necessarily England, you understand. People say things, well, in the United Kingdom, and really what they mean is England. And Michelle and I have to point out occasionally that there is actually more than England in the United Kingdom. There is Scotland, there is Wales, there is Northern Ireland. And they all have different systems. So when people say, well, in the United Kingdom, tuition fees have gone up. There's been a cap on tuition fees that has been taken off. That's not the same as Scotland and Wales, where tuition largely for home students still tends to be at a low level. Okay? In England, tuition fees have skyrocketed. It's now incredibly expensive to do an undergraduate degree in one of the top universities. The Times Educational Supplement estimated that when you put loans on top of fees, the average student is probably paying, and get this, you can convert this into ringgits, £100,000 over the period of a degree, particularly in the medical school or the law school, to get that particular qualification. Now that's very different here. Well, let's talk about the University of Malaya. It's very different than the University of Malaya, where fees are kept still relatively low for local students, slightly higher for international students. So what you're seeing in England is students going into universities carrying huge amounts of debt. From day one, carrying huge amounts of debt. And of course, the other side of that coin, which I feel very passionate about, is some of the students from the lower socioeconomic strata are not now able to get to university because they simply cannot afford it. So England is a unique case where you're seeing more and more increases in fees. However, on the other side of that coin, students who are now paying out £9,000 per year just on fees alone are now asking a very important question, and maybe they always asked it. They're asking the question, what am I getting for my money? What am I actually getting apart from my degree? What's the quality of my experience? What's the quality of the teaching and learning? What's the quality of the lecture theatre? Am I getting any high quality technology? So suddenly in England you've got a tension between higher income, higher tuition fees and higher student expectations. This is the net result of that particular tension. Much more focus and attention on the quality of student experience. I mean, we've always been concerned, haven't we, about the quality of student experience. We care about our students. We want them to have a good quality experience. But now it is an expectation. Students have set their expectations higher as a result of higher tuition fees. Universities are trying to respond by investing more in student liaison. They are generating pro-vice chancellors with a specific responsibility for student care, student relationships. And you're seeing an investment in greater student support and counselling. All that is costing money. Okay, so we're seeing good news, I suppose. Income has gone up because of tuition fees. The bad news is students expect more, so there needs to be more investment. This is a national student survey, and this is where students in England, and I think other parts of the United Kingdom actually, can rate their institution. And this survey is made public, and the institutions are actually ranked based on this student survey. So suddenly, student voice is very, very important. Where you appear in that league table is also very important. So suddenly we've got student voice being very important in terms of the future of higher education. I guess it always was, but it's more so now. They are very vocal and very active. Okay, number 3 is to do with funding. When I first went to university, universities were largely wholly funded by the government. They had block grants, so governments, in a sense, looked after the university funding. And soon governments realised as you increase participation in higher education and you get more and more universities, that becomes an untenable proposition. You cannot continue to fund more and more universities. It's untenable. Hence, tuition fees went up and government started to claw back large swathes of money, particularly research money. And I guess in my own institution, the University of Malaya, we're beginning to see that as the government starts to take back 40%, large amounts of resource from core funding. The argument is that universities should be more entrepreneurial and shouldn't rely on government. And I guess there is a substantial case for that argument. But on the other side, it means that some of the core business cannot be funded centrally any longer and has to be deployed through sort of soft money. Government funding in England and the UK generally is reduced. That's reshaping and redefining what higher education looks like. Now, it is perfectly possible for a university to fail. It is perfectly possible for a university to close. 20, 30 years ago, that would be unheard of. But in this new competitive marketplace, the laws of supply and demand, then universities are at the mercy of those very factors. Governments will fund up to a certain point, but beyond that, they will not fund. And universities are given the autonomy to generate their own funds. So that entrepreneurial edge is really important if universities are just blatantly going to survive. What have universities done in England to actually address that? Well, one obvious thing is you've only got 2 options really when it comes to this. You can either reduce your costs or you can increase your income, and universities have tried to do both. They've tried to reduce their costs, but that has been painful because it has meant, what's your biggest cost in universities? Your direct costs, your staff. So that has been painful. Departments have been shut. Whole sections have been reduced. So it's not been a comfortable experience. Some universities have closed or have merged, and I'll talk about the merger part. But really what we're seeing is a different financial gearing for universities, a different way of understanding the financial imperatives and the supply and demand sort of equation. My own institution, the Institute of Education in London, does anybody know that? Know of it? Was the largest education department. It's standalone. It was a standalone institute that delivered teacher training in London and more widely. Its problem was, I guess, that it didn't know if it was a small department, a large department or a small university. As soon as the tuition fee cap came off and costs also rose, it was clear that that institution could not stand alone any longer. So currently, the Institute of Education in London is now part of UCL, University College London. It caused a lot of angst, it caused a lot of consternation, a lot of consultation, but ultimately, if you looked at the financial bottom line, there was only one thing this institute could do to survive, and that was to merge. So, what I'm arguing is that universities in England are looking at different options when it comes to survival, and merger is certainly one. Closure is an option that many universities don't want to consider. Okay. I think the other, in the break, I don't know if you've been in to see the sort of augmented reality exhibition, which is just on the left side of the coffee. But if you get a chance, go in. It's absolutely fabulous. It's just stunning. And it reminded me of how important technology is now to the universities of the future. More important than ever before. And I know, Prof. Gauth, you were the Vice Chancellor of Multimedia University here in Malaysia, so you've been ahead of the game for some while. I think universities in England, not all, but some, are waking up to the fact that new technology is not going to go away, and it requires more than just doing a PowerPoint presentation. It requires a different understanding of teaching and learning. How have universities responded? Well, they responded in a variety of ways, but one thing they've done is to restructure their learning spaces. So where you're sitting currently in a lecture theatre is sufficient for teaching hundreds, maybe several hundreds of undergraduate students, but there's a question mark over the quality of that learning experience. So we're seeing different learning spaces as universities start to think about the student experience, the teaching and learning experience, teaching enhancement. You can't do good collaborative learning in a room like this, even though you might try. So universities are changing their buildings, investing in new technology. And again, you can see the equation. That means that costs are actually rising, and those costs have to be covered somehow. I'm just going to give you a minute. Just talk to each other. That's the University of Glasgow. Can you tell me where those students are? Just 1 minute. Talk to the person sitting next to you if you've got someone sitting. Where do you think their students are? Where are those students? It's not a cafeteria. It's not the Vice Chancellor's office. It's not Subway or McDonald's. It's actually the library. University of Glasgow had a very conventional library. It's a very conventional university, and Michelle and I had the good fortune to go there. And they said, oh, you must come and see our library. And we thought, oh dear, do we really want to go and see stacks of books? Not really. They said, oh, we've spent 20 million refurbishing it. And we walked in and we thought, well, first of all, we can't see any books. Secondly, there are no shelves. Thirdly, there's no librarian. And all we can see are young people in groups looking at monitors or reading together or drinking coffee together. And it was a wonderful learning environment. And that's an example, I guess, of the way you can change a very conventional idea of a library into something that's more dynamic and something that's more sort of, I guess, inclusive. So student collaboration was clearly on the top of their list there. Not every university has done that. Not every university has done that. Most universities, including the University of Malaya, if you go into the library, it looks like the libraries that I sat in a long time ago, and maybe some of the books are still on the shelf, gathering dust, and students are still talking too loudly with each other. And the only difference is they've got handphones now. We didn't have handphones then. But, we've got to think differently about teaching and learning. And I guess if students are presented with this, it radically changed their expectations of what learning and teaching is about in a university. If students are presented with a lecture theatre, it's a very conventional form. Now, not every single room in a university can be transformed into a wonderful teaching and learning space. The cost of that would be astronomical. But I think we need to recognise that for this younger generation, I don't know if Generation X or Y or Z now, but anyway, that generation coming through have got hugely different aspirations from the ones that we held in terms of what they expect in terms of technology. Okay, so leadership challenge number 5 is about research. Most universities, high-quality universities, rely heavily on the research component to get them through. That's where the bulk of their resource will come from. Of course, teaching now with higher tuition fees brings a slice of resource too. But most high-quality universities will rely on research. In England, that's how they get their reputation. Not on teaching, but on research. There's a research assessment exercise that weighs and measures universities every 4 years, normally Oxford, Cambridge and London, at the top of that list, and they change places ever so occasionally. But the point is that these universities are focused on research, they're research active, their staff are research active. But now it's much more competitive. So the new universities coming in, what we call the red brick, or even before then, newly established universities cannot compete. They just cannot compete in that research-intensive world. So now they are going into a different niche. They're saying, you know what, we're not even going to bother competing on the research side because we're just not that sort of animal. But what we are is a university is going to focus on teaching excellence and other things. So the market in England for universities is suddenly diversified. And you have your research-led universities, you have your teaching-led universities. And for the first time in England, there's now something called a teaching assessment exercise, which will weigh and judge universities based on the teaching quality. Diversification as well as massification. This is the response. Universities are now looking desperately for other sources of income. There were three streams normally. There's the research stream, there's the teaching stream, and there's the consultancy stream. Traditionally, they were the only three streams. Now, universities are trying to be much more innovative and entrepreneurial about the sorts of money that they can acquire. So, setting up their own businesses, for example, venture capital, for example, merging and actually collaborating with the other universities. And this is University of Oxford. Some of you might have been there. That's their library. You see, it looks nothing like the University of Glasgow library, right? It's a fairly traditional library. It's called the Triple Helix, and that means that universities in England are looking for a new relationship between government, industry, and other universities. And that's the Triple Helix. And I think people will talk about that, and what they mean is a new relationship between those three parties. Okay. The final challenge, which I know much more than the other five, is around leadership. And I think we have always known that this is important, but there are certain challenges that remain around leadership. It is the case in most universities. Most universities, in my view, are overmanaged and underled. In other words, that the management, the efficiency, the effectiveness tends to dominate the normal practices. That doesn't mean that leadership doesn't exist, it's just probably not as high on the horizon as we would like it to be. There's also a pipeline problem. You know, nobody starts their first day, well I didn't anyway, and probably it's a good reason why I didn't, thinking I want to be Vice-Chancellor. Right? No young academic comes in and goes, you know what, maybe some do, but most don't think, oh, that's what I aspire to be, a head of department or a pro-vice-chancellor or vice-chancellor. They don't see their academic careers that way. So there is a pipeline problem. Where do you get brilliant vice-chancellors from, deputy vice-chancellors from? Where do you get them from? Unless we grow them within the system. They don't just pop up, they don't just emerge. Well, maybe you did, Gav, but you know, most great leaders don't just sort of suddenly self-combust into being a university leader. There's some real issues in academia of recognition and reward. You know, do we reward leadership in universities? Do we actually see that as an important part? Is it better to be a great leader in a university, or is it better to be a great academic? Maybe you can be both. Some people can. And what type of leadership? So I'm going to sort of focus the remainder of what I have to say on the type of leadership. One of the responses, is this still working? One of the responses is not working. You've shut me off. That's normally a good way to stop anyone's talk. Pull the plug out or take the microphone away. No, it's not working. Is this working? Not working either. It was working earlier. I haven't pulled any plugs out. I haven't touched anything. I don't like shouting at people. That's not a good thing to do, is it? And when I'm thinking about leadership at the moment, I'm thinking about what's happening across the Atlantic. The presidential election. That's an interesting one, isn't it? I'm not thinking of that sort of leadership, by the way. This foundation in England was established because of all the problems that I raised about the pipeline. Where do you get good academic leaders from? So this was set up in order to solve that particular problem. Okay, this is the University of Warwick. Another way of solving the problem is actually to produce a course. And most universities, probably Senge, will have a course for leaders. And the hope is that they go on the course and they then magically become university leaders. Well, some do, some don't. So universities know there's a problem. And the response to the problem varies from university to university. But normally it's to do with training, preparation, and a little bit of on-the-job, I guess, experience too. That's... Okay, so this is my question, I guess. And it's a question that I also am preoccupied with when I think about education more generally, when I think about schools. What type of leadership do we need for a very different world in the 21st century, and a particularly unpredictable one for the 21st century? What sort of leadership do we need in higher education? Because the universities of the future will be nothing like they are today. So we need my argument is we need a different sort of leadership. We need a radically different sort of leadership. The reason for this is because our organizations are changing. Our models of leadership are normally predicated on fairly bureaucratic organizations built on an industrial model of organizations where everyone had a role and a responsibility that was clearly defined. If we think about our modern organizations like Google or Apple or Senge or the University of Malaya, that model just doesn't fit any longer. I mean, Peter Senge said a long time ago that the top-down leadership is inherently inadequate for the challenges that we now face. I've come back on. You see, that's the power of leadership. Did you notice that? Yeah, that's fine, thank you. I'm back on. The alarm went off. I've caused all sorts of trouble being here this morning, all sorts of trouble. All right, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to think about this representation. And it's an obvious one, but I think it's worth thinking about. If you think about your own organizations, what does leadership look like within that organization? Does it look like the great man leader, normally they're men, or a great female leader, or is it more collective? So just 1 minute, talk to the person sitting. What does leadership look like in your institution, in your university, or wherever you work? Okay. I mean, that's just, I guess, a point of reflection. When we think about leadership, we normally think about individual leadership. If you go into any bookstore or any airport and you look at the range of books on leadership, it's normally what I call the I did it my way type of leadership, which is somebody describing how they change an organization, and largely to do with them, largely to do with their role, largely to do with their charisma, and all that is fine. However, what I'm going to talk about is the opposite of that, the antithesis of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're learning from the business sector about effective leadership and high-performing organizations within that sector and what the leadership looks like. I'm not saying that one or other of these is better. I'm saying that they are different, and probably in some organizations you need both types of leadership. But for too long, I think we've relied on the single individual to transform our organizations. And, you know, if you get a great leader like Prof. Gauth, then yes, of course, that can happen. But great leaders like Prof. Gauth don't come in, you know, high supply, in my experience anyway. So we need to think differently about leadership. And I'm going to end my talk by talking about the way we need to think differently about leadership. This is Peter Senge that I sort of highlighted earlier, and I think that, you know, this is him in 2006, basically challenging the status quo of the leadership literature and saying, you know, really we do need to think about leadership a little differently in our organizations than the way we currently think about them. I've been writing and thinking a lot about what I call distributed leadership. It comes from social psychology, it comes from the business world, but we've now begun to see it happening in schools, in school systems, in higher education. Essentially what distributed leadership means is that leadership is a shared, a collective, is not about role and responsibility, but is more about capacity building. And there's evidence coming out of the University of Pittsburgh, its business schools, to demonstrate that organizations that are high performing, that continue to be high performing and manage to sustain themselves in a competitive marketplace tend to have shared or distributed leadership. In other words, high performing teams tend to make high performing organizations. That's what the business literature would tell us. The implications for universities are these. And I think if I think about what I've done at my small institution, the one thing I think I can claim is I've built a strong team. I said to Prof. Gauth that once I built my team and once they were functional, then my job was done. And like any good leader, what your team say about you is that, you know, they don't need you. When they don't need you any longer, your job is done. I built powerful teams, and that's more difficult in universities. I mean, I know there are academic teams and there are subject teams, but really what I'm talking about is not that. I'm talking about people who come together across academic functions in order to think differently. If we think the way we've always thought, we're going to get exactly what we've always got. How do universities get that competitive edge in a globalized marketplace? And my argument is that leadership is part of the answer to that, but a different sort of leadership, a leadership that actually empowers rather than a leadership that controls. This is a book that I wrote with a colleague of mine called Andy Hargreaves from Boston College in the US. We looked at high-performing organizations in 3 sectors: in business, in sport, and in education, including universities and schools. And we asked a simple but profound question: what does leadership look like in our best-performing organizations across these very different sectors? And the answer that came back was actually rather simple. They look the same. The contexts are different, but guess what? They look more similar than different. And I can't go into everything that the book highlights, but one thing I will say is that we found that collective or shared leadership was being used as a strategy, not an outcome. It was a deliberate strategy to improve the performance of these organizations. There's a danger that collective or shared leadership will be seen as warm or fuzzy and ineffective. But in the best organizations, they build great teams, and those great teams actually give the competitive advantage. So, we concluded, one of our conclusions from the book was that you need to collaborate in order to compete. And that might seem, in a sense, a contradiction. But what we see from the research evidence is that organizations that collaborate, both with other organizations and also within their organizations, are much more able and ready to compete in an uncertain world. Building the capacity for change and development is at the heart of any successful organization, including a university. So to conclude, the bell hasn't gone, so I'm assuming I got a little bit more time. I'm not going to take much of it. Here are the opportunities for universities that I see in gaining that competitive edge. If we don't invest in the leaders, particularly the young leaders coming into our universities today or tomorrow or next week, it's too late for them to catch up several years or maybe a decade down the line. Reward and recognition. Yes, we need the training and preparation, but we also need to model the sort of leadership that we want. And that means if we believe in teams, then we need to establish them, support them, and nurture them. Growing your own, developing leaders from within your organization. I've talked about capacity building, I've talked about entrepreneurial leadership, and I've talked about collaborative and distributed leadership. So, to conclude, this is the way in which that report that I highlighted at the start defines entrepreneurial leadership. And it's worth a look. It's certainly worth a look in terms of how it begins to define the different facets of what this entrepreneurial leadership approach might be. But at the heart of it, if you see, it's building culture and shared ways of doing things. Now, you're all going to say to me that that isn't possible because everybody's got KPIs and they've got their own job remit. And I know, but it is possible. At the boundaries, it is possible. And that is a cultural thing. And remember, this isn't just about a warm, fuzzy feeling. This is about a competitive advantage in an increasingly globalized world. So leadership is the key to organizational growth and development. There's not a single example anywhere around the world, I'm on time, where, Saved by the Bell, where an organization has not improved itself without leadership being somewhere in the mix. But it isn't necessarily the leadership of the individual. So that's the big message from today. Okay, that's my sort of representation of future leaders. I don't know why they're penguins, but they're penguins, okay? And I think a recognition that you already have an organization that's dedicated to doing just this, to developing leaders. This is my website. If you'd like to send comments or any money, that would be fantastic. I'm not serious about the money. We're not, And all just to say finally, thank you very much for inviting me here today, Prof. Gauth, Vice Chancellor. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And thank you very much indeed. Terima kasih. I can take a few questions if they're easy, yes.
Okay, really she has stimulated us on this topic of leadership in education. Actually, I should have been closer to her all these years. I realized that she has actually done a lot of work on, a lot of research on leadership and so on. So I have to apologize to you, Prof, for not giving more time to listening to you. But today I've listened attentively to you. I think the story about budget cuts is everywhere. That's what she has told us. More autonomy, but with less money. That's the same story here in Malaysia as well as in the UK. And new technology like online technologies and so on will change the whole landscape. So I think the story is somewhat similar to Malaysia, in the US, to UK and so on. So I think some of the questions that Prof. Feng was not able to answer or averted from answering, you can pose it to her also. So let's take 3 questions, then go on to my part. Prof, please.
Prof, my name is Muhammad Dahan. I suppose you are familiar with the Malaysian education blueprint for higher education.
Yes.
Where the first thrust is about producing graduates that are holistic, entrepreneurial, balanced. Mm-hmm. So that phrase, trilogy of holistic, entrepreneurial, and balanced, shouldn't that also be the criteria for choosing vice chancellors, deans, and heads of department? Thank you.
A very short answer is yes, in my view. I think that the education blueprint, both the higher education one and the education blueprint, are very good documents, and I think that the aspirations are the right aspirations. Like any good document, is how you put it into practice, how you implement it is going to be key. So the aspiration is the right aspiration. Certainly the aspiration beyond new graduates, but yeah, I agree with you, yes.
Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Morning.
Afternoon, I think.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Just a quick question. The distributed leadership. Sorry, my name is Aziz. I'm from a government company, ATSB. So your concept of distributive leadership is very interesting. But in your experience in implementing such a scheme, how do you manage ego?
I mean, in a way, distributed leadership, the implication is it is leadership without ego, okay? I mean, ultimately, if you think about Jim Collins and his work on Good to Great, if you haven't read the book, have a look at the book. He talks about the level 5 leader, exceptional leaders running the best corporations in the United States. And he says that the best leaders are ambitious for their institutions first and then themselves. And what I see so often are people who are ambitious for themselves first and then their institution. So if you're clever, and everybody in this room is clever, then it's really saying that the individual leader can only do so much, only can touch so many parts of the organization. But if you build strong, collaborative, powerful teams, the chances of doing a lot more are a lot greater.
One more question.
And then I'm off the hook.
Yes, sir.
By collective leadership, I'm sure you don't mean that every decision is made by a committee.
No.
Because we know that when God makes horse and have a committee, it becomes a zebra.
No.
So what do you mean by collective leadership? There is still a leader.
Yeah, there is still a leader. It's the interface between the formal and the informal leadership, and absolutely we don't want anything decided by committee, because in my views committees never decide anything apart from when the next meeting is going to be. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who come together for a specific purpose and bring their respective talents together. And remember, we tend to have an age and stage view of leadership, that leaders have to be a certain age or a stage in their career. But what I've done in my institution is bring forward, and what Dr. Michelle has done, is bring forward exceptionally good young leaders. So think about this question. What's the most pressing issue that you're facing at your institution? What's the most pressing issue? And there may be more than one. Now think about who is best placed to work in a team to solve that problem with you. And that team may not carry on. It'll be dismantled when the task is done. So it's not about management or leadership by committee. It's actually about very specific task-focused groups that help the institution to solve problems. Done. Thank you.